Welcome to the Liminauts podcast. Interviews with individuals testing the liminal spaces between disciplines, perspectives, and practices, with a focus on Buddhism, spirituality, science, philosophy, and wellness from a left perspective. I'm your host, Ben Hawes. On today's episode of the Liminauts, my guest is Robert Zevin. Zevin grew up in a family made of Jewish refugees from Poland and the Ukraine. One side started the World Publishing Company, while the other ran a Borscht Belt resort in the Catskills that became a refuge for Jewish communists and other leftists during the Depression. In the late 60s, as a professor of economics at Columbia, Zevin got involved with the United States Servicemen's Fund, which was responsible for the FTA Show, an anti-war counterprogram of troop entertainment. In the 1970s, and along with Robert Schwartz, Zevin then helped invent the idea of socially responsible or sustainable investing, which is now a $30 trillion segment of investments known as ESG. Robert Zevin is also my grandfather, so I hope you enjoy this very special episode as much as I did.
I grew up in a family which was so distant from religious observances that I didn't even know I was Jewish until I was about 12 or 13 years old. And then it was because I was with my mother in a delicatessen, which to me was just like another place to go buy food. When some other young man, even maybe my age, maybe a year or two younger, who also went to the Hawkins School, said, "Oh, I didn't know you were Jewish." And I don't think I said anything in return except, "Hi, how are you?" But I asked my mother what the hell that meant.
At 12? Wow.
Yes. And so she explained it, and of course I understood about things like Israel. And
about what year would this be?
About 1947 or 48.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I knew about a lot of political things. I was very interested in Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture who ran for president.
Henry Wallace?
Henry Wallace, yeah. I was very, very well aware of and positively inclined toward the Wallace campaign with its, firm opposition to nuclear weapons, which everyone in my family, as soon as Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, with the exception of my father, everyone was horrified and wondering if it couldn't have been done some other way, if it had to really be done at such human cost. And, if there weren't some effective way to make sure that it never happened again. And I think all three of my sisters felt that way. My politics were basically disarmament and nonviolence and opposed to war. I belonged. At a very young age, I signed up for an international organization, a little bit like Amnesty, but more focused on global disarmament. I just can't remember the name of it. I don't think it exists anymore, but it persisted for a long time. And then, some years later, I got involved with other organizations that where interestingly enough, typically in the 50s and early 60s, the youth wing of a lot of organizations had radically different points of view about the Cold War than the elderly founders and mucky mucks. My father was one of those in the Americans for Democratic Action, and I was part of a strong movement in the youth part of Americans for Democratic Action, which I think it was in quite a bit later when I was already in college, maybe 1961, maybe 1959, I don't remember exactly, that I got elected chairman of the Youth League of Americans for Democratic Action. And the response of the of the leadership of the organization was to tell me I was locked out of my office and they were going to have a new convention. So that didn't last very long. But
because you were to the left of the adult non-youth part of the organization.
Far too much. Yeah, and I think I was not. Obviously, I was not out of line with a lot of the young people, but I think the particular meeting that I attended, which was held in just outside New York City at the Sarah Lawrence campus, actually, I think they may have had a good case that it wasn't a representative gathering, and of course that a lot of people that I knew to be radical left were there, including Michael Harrington.
Oh yeah,
and
of DSA.
Yes, who had been before he became respectable for his book about poverty in America. He had been a longtime member of one of the two Trotskyite organizations in the U.S., and before that, the Catholic Worker, which was also very left of the rest of the Catholic Church, and they supported me. I think mostly because they knew me rather than that they thought I was a loyal communist. And the guy I ran against was married. I remembered that I had known about him when the year I taught at Berkeley. He was married to the daughter of the chairman of Pacific Gas and Electric, and he was a Communist Party member.
Okay.
So I led the Trotskyite victory over the communists, much to the despair of the adults in the organization.
Did they call you a revisionist?
No, they didn't call me anything. They just told me that I could forget about trying to get into my office because they changed the keys. But of course, I wasn't about to hop on a train or a plane and go to Washington just to go to my office. And my father was on the board at ADA, so it was a little awkward for him and for me. But most of what I did, the mentoring thing I did after I had my PhD, partly because I was too busy to do a lot of things, except go to demonstrations. Then I founded two organizations against the war in Vietnam. The first one was called Resist, and I wrote to everybody I could think of all over the country with a call to resist illegitimate authority, which I had drafted, and a lot of people, including a lot of Nobel Prize winners, were willing to sign it. A few people wanted to change the language a little, which I negotiated with them, and so that was published, I think, in 1967 or 1968. I think in the Wall Street Journal because the New York Times wouldn't take it, and then in several other places as well. And we had a press conference in New York, which was widely covered with a few fairly well-known people, Noam Chomsky and a guy at Columbia who was a philosopher, but who wrote anyway. Most of them were authors, but there were a lot of scientists and actors who signed, but they just weren't there for that particular meeting. So then I assembled about 50 people for lunch at my expense at the Columbia Faculty Club, and we formed Resist and agreed what we would do and how we would do it. And Resist still exists today, but it's branched out to being all kinds of progressive organizations, not just anti-war organizations. And then just a year after that, there was a strike at Columbia. Must have been 1969 or 68. I must have had the first one, 68, 69. And Resist was started in 68. And then a year later, there was this occupation movement at Columbia, which was only imitating what had already been done at Berkeley and other places. But it was still a pretty big deal. And all kinds of people were there, including somebody who was already in touch with the GI anti-war movement and had already been involved with establishing coffee houses for GIs outside bases where people who felt really uncomfortable about the war could come and talk. And he contacted me because of what I had done with Resist and asked if I would start an organization to propagate and support the coffee houses, which I did. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It was called the United States Servicemen's Fund.
Okay.
It's kind of a play of words on the UFO. So that took up a big part of my time for 2 or 3 years. And we started about, round numbers, a dozen more GI coffee houses in the U.S., one in Hawaii, and we also worked with Joan Baez and her then boyfriend, whose name is also escaping me, Canadian actor. He's very good and tall, blonde hair. Anyway, we worked with them to make a show that they did at various coffee houses. We had a lot of other folk singers and people like Noam Chomsky who went to the bases as well. And after they got going, I found someone to make a film of it. And as the war was coming to an end, we began to try to, distribute the film all over the country. Well, we did show it at all the coffee houses, but she got angry when we tried to make it a general release film because she thought it would interfere with her not as yet incomplete path to an Oscar Best Actress award. So she killed it basically. She had more leverage in the theater business than we did by far. But we fought about it.
Is the film still around?
Some people have the copies of it. Yes.
Is it do you know if it's ever been put up on YouTube or anything?
I don't really know. There's at least one person I haven't spoken to in a while that I know has a copy.
Well, if we find it, I can when I post part of this and put part of this up, I can find a link to it and I can direct people to it if it's extant on YouTube.
It's definitely extant, on Reels, but whether it's on YouTube, I don't know.
You'd be surprised, but yeah, we'll it'd be interesting to find out.
It's called the FTA Show.
The FTA Show
for Fuck the Army. Yes.
Nice. And that's the name of the movie too, the FTA Show?
Yes.
Nice. Yeah, I was wondering if we could rewind back to the family in 20s and 30s. I mean, basically the background of the family and what you came into that shaped your politics.
Sure, I'll do my best.
Sure.
So my father's family came around 1907, I think. Although his oldest sister, Sarah, came almost 10 years earlier, like 1898 or 1899. But the rest waited until one of his brothers, who was very ill, passed away. And then they came, like so many Jews from Ukraine, in exactly that time period. And it's a good thing they did, because those who stayed were all slaughtered.
In pogroms.
First by the communists and then by the Germans, so not and even by their neighbors, Although my father did tell me about a neighbor who put them all up in his basement during one of the pogroms to protect them. So the funny thing about my father's family is that every last one of them was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, except for my father, who was vehemently anti-communist. And his motivation was essentially, well, I think it was two things. On the one hand, he knew a lot more about the trials and the executions than they did, and he also was much more. I mean, he was a vehement anti-communist,
but still on the left.
But what? Well, yes, the left. Left
broadly construed.
His left was basically, the Democratic Party in New York City, where he grew up, and then the Democratic Party under Roosevelt.
Okay.
When he was in Cleveland, he wrote a book shortly after Roosevelt died. He edited a book actually of Roosevelt's speeches, selected speeches, and he was very active in organizations, especially the Council for a Livable World, that supported what we might, for lack of a better word, could just call Roosevelt's foreign policy initiatives, which were pretty much Truman's and Eisenhower's as well.
Right.
And he was extremely aware, far more than any of his brothers and sisters, or his children, for that matter, of the crimes that were being committed by the communists in occupied East Europe, and in Russia itself. So that's my father. My mother was born here. Her father and mother both were born in a small village in Poland, about 30 or 40 miles from the capital. And he was very talented and was sent to rabbinical school when he was maybe 14, something like that. And he didn't like it at all. He ran away. He somehow managed to feed himself and walk across Europe from Poland to someplace like Belgium or the Netherlands, and earn enough money to get a passage to London, where he had a distant relative who was a bookbinder, and he signed up to work with him, and he learned something about bookbinding, and he saved money, and he took another ferry across steamship across the Atlantic to Canada, and I think it was in Toronto where he then spent 2 or 3 years working with another person who I think was also a bookbinder, but I'm not 100% sure. And then he came to Cleveland, and it was only 1901, so he squeezed a lot in. And he was born in. They were born in 1880.
So he's 21. So he landed in Cleveland around 21. So he had already done all that by 21. Wow.
Yes, it's amazing.
Wow.
He started this company, and it was a bookbinding company, but it was also a printing company before too long. It was very successful. It's hard for me to put my mind in exactly who. I know who the printing customers were later, but I don't know who they were for him. And within a year or two, he sent for my grandmother, who was his first cousin, and they got together. They got married, and they were prolific right off the bat. They had Herman, Julius, and my mother from 1903 to 1907. And then I think they thought they were through, and they were very surprised when they had Shirley in 1923. I'm not sure that they had any particular politics. Or they brought all of their cousins eventually were here, but brothers and sisters and cousins were here. So it was quite a large family. And some of them worked at World Publishing. Some of them were eye doctors, ophthalmologists. Some of them were other kind of mid-level specialties. One was an architect. I think I mentioned that already. When we grew up, they were all around. We would go to my mother's parents' house for Passover and for Christmas, and just every once in a while, just to have a Sunday meal with almost all the whole family there. My grandfather didn't seem to have any politics that I was aware of. He was very cultured. He was very interested in literature. He loved opera, but I don't think he had any strong feelings about the kinds of political issues that were, that my father was so interested in, that I've always been interested in.
And in World Publishing his company, right?
Yes.
So did encyclopedias and Gideon Bibles, among other things,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Yes. So that started very early. I mean, World Publishing was really good at printing from a very early time, and it was partly my grandfather and partly his oldest son, Herman, both of whom were really skillful and invented a lot of things that are patented in the print. Well, not anymore, but that were an important part of the printing business for a long time. So the printing jobs were often, well, one that goes to the cleverness of it all was printing a Bible, a King James Bible that was so small you could put it in your vest pocket on your shirt, and that was sold for $1 in the dime stores of the time. And so that was a big product. and then, another product that goes way, way back that was still a product when the company went out of business there's an office in Cleveland of the Accounting Standards Board, which published a book that had tables of numbers and of course in those days without computers and slide rules, they had logarithms for numbers, from 1 to 1,000 by tenths. So 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. It was a thick little book, but not huge. It was a little bigger than a novel, but I still have one. Although I haven't used it in a long time because it's not necessary anymore. But that was a big deal. And a lot of it was just plain printing. But my grandfather was very interested in my mother's father in Yiddish literature or its translation into English in some cases. And he began to publish poems and stories by Yehoash and other Jewish writers who were active in Western Europe or in some cases in the United States. Not sure I know what and the next thing was after my father got there was, I think, one of the first publishing companies anywhere to do reprints of successful books. So they did reprints of classics that had been written in the 1800s, and they did reprints of books which had been sold 2 or 3 years before. So just like now, in hardbound copies with expensive, pretty-looking jackets, but they did them in very inexpensively bound and printed versions. They
like mass market versions,
right? Like the rack and the train station versions. And this was before there were actually paperbacks, but it was it was 90% of the way to being the same as a paperback. As it went on, they looked more and more like what was shortly to become paperbacks. I don't know when the first original books were published, where the author was discovered by or accepted by World Publishing and a book of fiction or nonfiction was published. But I guess the story of World, the next big thing is the dictionary, which was kind of in everybody's mind even before World War II. And the work kind of began during World War II. And I believe the first actual release of the Webster's New World Dictionary of the American Language was 1952 or 53. So it took a long time, and it was a lot of work, and there were a lot of people involved. And it was, if you've ever read what's his name's book about making the first English dictionary also in the 1700s and into the early 1800s, that uses, it looks for actual usage instead of just the author's opinion. It changed it. Every other dictionary company in America, copied it. But Webster's
was the original actual usage dictionary.
Yes.
Of American dictionary, American English usage dictionary.
Yeah. So, but Noah Webster had done that in 1808 or something, his first edition, and this was an interesting thing because World called it Webster's New World Dictionary of the American Language, and Merriam-Webster, which had been publishing its own dictionary for a long, long time, sued and said, "No, we're Webster," and World said, "No, you're not." Webster was full of interest in citations of current language, and your dictionary is old. You haven't done anything to keep up. And it went to the Supreme Court, and World won.
Really?
Yeah, and it was a good dictionary. I think basically that after World went out of business, and then after Times Mirror went out of business, it was kind of two blows against it, and it never really survived that. So I think it doesn't even exist anymore. But it was a very good dictionary and very, very contemporary. It was the only dictionary where you could look up "fuck," for example, and probably a number of other similar words. and that was good because why shouldn't people, if people use it all the time, people who don't know what they're talking about ought to be able to look it up all the time. It makes perfectly good sense. And that was a big fight too, with a lot of school boards and libraries, but people got used to the idea.
Hey folks, during the next section of the interview, the audio quality is a bit wonky. We had trouble getting Robert's audio set up to work for Zoom, so we had to do it over the phone. So here you go, the next part of the interview.
Okay, so if you can hear me okay, we can just start here. I'm so sorry. I have four different tech platforms have failed.
Yeah, it's not your fault. It's mine, I'm sure. I'm just not good at this.
No worries. None of us should be good at this. We should be happy human beings. Instead, tech rules us. So I was wondering if, you could just talk about, I know we talked before about the resorts, the Jewish resorts in the Catskills and kind of the Borscht Belt stuff, and some of your family, some of your father's family, some of her family, was it your aunts and uncles who had more of a connection to that? Like who were you staying with when you visited the Catskills, and what was that scene like?
Yeah, so when my father's family decided they were going to come here, they decided not to leave until a very ill young boy died, which I think he had tuberculosis, but it took about 3 years. So in advance of that, the oldest daughter, Sarah, came early. So she came around 1898, and everybody else came around 1905. And those are very approximate, but I think they get the essence of it. And she scouted things out. She helped find them a place when they came, and after they came, and she had been here a while and earned some money, she opened a kind of resort in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. What New York City people call upstate New York. It's really still south of Albany. And in the Catskill Mountains. And I'm not sure exactly when she started it, but I know that's where my mother and father met, actually, in the early 1930s. So, and I know it was open through the Depression, but I don't know how long in advance of that. I don't know when she actually did it. Could have been before World War I. It could have been 1920s, but she started this resort, which of course in those days was almost exclusively frequented by other people who were Jewish and for the most part East European immigrants, or children of European immigrants. And during the Depression, it was also kind of a place for some of her unemployed brothers and sisters to live, because there was a roof over their heads, there was food, there were toilets. So if you were completely out of work, you had no money, and you were one of the relatives, that was where you went. So 2 or 3, I think, of my father's siblings, I'm quite certain his brother Irving for sure, and I don't know who else, went up there along with the oldest aunt who had founded it and ran it. And as I mentioned, they all became members of the Communist Party, and so it became kind of a place where people with progressive politics would hang out. So that's my only explanation of how my mother ended up there, because it was mostly people from New York who went there, and mostly people, but also people who had very progressive politics. And that's where she met my father.
Okay.
And that was about, well, they got married, I think, in 1935, so it was probably 1933 or 34. I have a few photographs with dates on them that might let me guesstimate a little closer, but I think that's about right. The camp was kind of a refuge during the Depression for all of the relatives, and in the case of all of my father's other relatives, their progressive comrades. to hang out if they were out of a job, and a lot of them did. So I think that's probably what my mother knew and what encouraged her to give it a try and go there. That it was a place where people with similarly progressive ideas, were in the vast majority. So they met. I guess it was something close to love at first sight, and so they had me pretty promptly after they got married. And my mother already had one daughter, and my father already had two daughters. So, boom, they had 4 children.
Do you think that your background influenced your study of economics when you went to school, or was just how did you get into economics?
Yeah, let me just go back, to your interpretation of what I was saying, which I think we also covered a little bit last time. But I was not aware of all the things that I've been telling you now.
Sure.
About the political alignments of especially different people in my father's family, but also even the people that my mother invited over to the house. And there weren't even too many of those until the war was over. So I just didn't know that much. I didn't know much of anything about politics, really. I remember watching the Democratic Party convention in 1948, and that's about the earliest. I remember the Henry Wallace campaign, and I'm pretty sure I'm almost positive my mother voted for him, and I certainly would have if I had been old enough. But I became much more, acutely aware of both my mother's and my father's politics much later, when I was quite a bit older. But I was interested in politics, but in a very kind of primitive way, because I didn't really understand very much. So I don't know if I told you last time, but when I was in 4th grade or 5th grade, I felt some antagonism toward the bully in the class, and I organized what I called an isolationist movement, which was inspired by Senator Robert Taft's isolationism. This is actually after the end of the war. And so I said, we're going to isolate him, thinking that's what isolationists did. And I got corrected. At some point I told my mother, I think, and I got corrected about what it meant and who was doing it. And who was doing it to whom, really, but I had no clue. So I don't think I really understood very much about politics until high school, and then it was a little bit from classroom, and it was a little bit from watching the convention, starting with the 1948 convention when I was only 11 years old. But after that, 52, I was already, I think, had a reasonably good understanding of what the issues were, especially about civil rights. And I think after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both my 2 older sisters, my 3 older sisters and I and my mother all agreed that nuclear weapons should never, ever have been used and should never be used again. Whereas my father felt very strongly and made it very vocally clear that it was better to have blown up 2 cities and killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese than to have had to lose American lives in an invasion, which he believed, always. He never changed that belief, and he never changed his belief that it would be fine to use nuclear weapons to stop a Soviet invasion of Europe or something like that. Even after the Soviets also had nuclear weapons, which seemed a little crazy to me. But
have you seen Oppenheimer?
I have not. I was fortunate enough to get to meet him shortly before he died when he came to Cambridge, and had a conversation with some other people that I knew in Cambridge. But I didn't see the movie. Maybe I should.
Yeah, because it's mostly about his travels among fellow travelers in the Communist Party that he never joined, but every single person he knew was a member, and that got him in trouble later. But it's really about him kind of assembling a team, and then basically kind of his trying to thread this needle of flirting with radicalism, but also wanting to, be, have the power and the ability to, do what he needed to do, and then later on getting him into trouble and him being persecuted and after the war. So it's also about like his ambiguity about being both a anti-fascist and then also his realization of the fact that he couldn't control how the bomb was going to be used after it was made. So it's actually quite nuanced, surprisingly, and I think you might like it.
I'll look at it. That sounds good. Yeah. We don't go to many movies anymore, but we'll see it on TV, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a generally benign view of the Communist Party for quite a long time. Maybe a little bit because I eventually knew, by the time I was in high school, I guess I knew that all my father's brothers and sisters were members of the Communist Party. But I also began to meet other people when I was at Antioch who came to Antioch. They weren't necessarily students there, but I got to meet them anyway. One guy's name I'm forgetting was head of the Communist Party in Ohio, and then later when I was in college, in graduate school, he was the head of the Communist Party in the USA with headquarters in New York. So, I haven't written for my FBI pictures yet, but I know for sure that they took a number of me with him, going in and out of his office, especially on 12th Street, I think, in Lower Manhattan. Anyway, my own views became a lot less. I kind of got detached from the Democratic Party, maybe, well, even before Kennedy. I voted for Kennedy because I thought he was maybe a little bit different. And I'm not so sure that he was really, but we'll never know. But I think, no, that's not true. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I don't think I ever in my life for a long time, until maybe very recently, went to vote against Trump. I don't think I ever voted for either the Republican or Democratic Party nominee for president.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's true. Maybe the one time would have been, when Trump ran the first time. But other than that, I'm sure I never did, either before or after. So my politics were, I wanted to call myself a social democrat rather than a socialist because I had some skepticism about state ownership and about the effectiveness of socialist governments, although the Scandinavians were always there as a pretty good example of how well it could work, until they threw it out themselves, which kind of took the wind out of my sails. But I thought that the idea that the government could do more, that it could intervene more, that capitalism was not the best design for a system that would benefit everybody and treat people justly and fairly, and that it needed to be governed and controlled and held at bay by the government, using its own power, and that virtually every country in Europe was proof of how well, how positive and generally relatively easy it was to do that, although it's still a hard sell in America. It's a hard sell in words, but in fact, America does a lot of it too. America does it to hand out something to the poor without taking anything from the rich. At least it does something for the poor. Every other country tries to take something from the rich as well, but America's an outstanding exception. Not to mention current Soviet Union, but there aren't too many others.
Was your interest in studying economics, did that come out of a political feeling, or was that just you just thought economics were cool?
Yeah. So when I graduated from high school and when I got to Antioch, I thought I wanted to be a writer. I thought I wanted to be either a writer of nonfiction or a writer of short stories or and novels or newspaper writer, but I wanted to write. I thought more than anything, and I did get a chance to write, and I did get positive feedback. Although I was with a couple of other people who ended up being much more successful as writers than I. And the same thing in high school, where my best friend went on to be. This was Euclid, Ohio High School, which was not exactly a hotbed of wealthy intellectuals, but one of my classmates, Roger Zelazny, became a very, very successful science fiction writer, and unfortunately died, in his 40s of cancer. But so he won the writing prize, and I won the poetry prize when we graduated from Euclid Senior High School. But I wanted to be a writer of nonfiction, and my best opportunity came when I was the editor of the Antioch newspaper, but I also wanted to be a social activist, so I sort of turned the newspaper into a political campaign organizer, including a boycott of the local barbershop for not taking black students as customers in a town which had only one barbershop, which we won. So that was a very satisfying victory. So I wanted to write. I was doing pretty well at writing, and my father sent me Galbraith's The Affluent Society, which was
that's John Kenneth Galbraith.
John Kenneth Galbraith.
Yep.
All of his books were very successful, but this was the most successful of all of his books. And I was maybe in my second, maybe even my third year, and I thought, wow, he writes really well. If I could be an economist who writes, that wouldn't be so bad. And also, he not only did he write, but he also had very progressive views and very reasonable solutions with very convincing arguments. And I thought, wow, that's a whole life it's a whole life experience I could be having if I combine my skills as a writer with some background in economics, and I got to write books about all of this. And maybe I'd be a teacher too, but that would be secondary. So I announced to everybody that I wanted to be a economics major, and they suggested that, and this included a guy who had graduated from MIT and then went back to teach at MIT, but was only temporarily at Antioch for a few years. He suggested that the smartest thing for me to do was to be a math major, because that would be the easiest way to get into graduate school. And he was so right. He was so correct. I couldn't believe it. I got accepted everywhere, and it was not because I had taken more than 2 economics courses. It was because I was a math major, and then I'd gotten a master's in math. But I don't think that was the decisive thing. I think the math major period was the decisive thing, because that was the big thing that, economics had to become more scientific and more mathematical, which it did in spades, from that time till right now. But that was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to write like Kenneth Galbraith. But they not only accepted me at Harvard, later on they let me waive the foreign language requirement, which I don't think I could have passed, because I've never, I flunked French on test in high school, and then partly because I got diabetes and had to stay out of school for a while, and in college, and I was best in my class in Latin, but I couldn't really read a page of Latin even then, let alone now. I've never been able to master a foreign language in my life, so the math was a lifesaver. I don't think I would have graduated. I mean, they may have let me in, but they never would have let me out. But I went to Harvard. In retrospect, I'm not sure it was the best choice. The thing that scared me away from Chicago was not that it was right wing, which it wasn't so much then, as that it had that everything had a number instead of a name. So it was every building had a number, every course had a number, everything had a number. And I thought, this is crazy. I mean, why not call it macroeconomics instead of course number 8727? And that alone scared me off. But in fact, it turned out I didn't even know that Chicago was the bulwark of right-wing economics, and very anti-Keynesian, very anti-government intervention. So I'm glad I didn't go there. And of all the major universities in economics, it was the only one, that was in that end of the spectrum. Although now half of them are pretty right-wing, but not that. So I went to. My wife Rita wanted to go to medical school, and she'd also not done it, so she wanted to go take biochemistry for a year at Ohio State, and then apply again. So I that's where I got my master's in math for that year, and then I went to Harvard, and discovered that while a lot of people had taken a lot more economics courses than I had, I didn't seem to be having any trouble at all understanding what seemed to me like very elementary and often unrealistic ways of talking about the economy. Galbraith wasn't there. He was the ambassador to India when I got to Harvard. That was a big disappointment, but he came back, and I got to know him quite well, and I was one of his teaching assistants. And I stayed friendly with him whenever I was still in Cambridge, which was most of the time. The thing that the guy who really captured my attention and affection in year one of courses was Alexander Gerschenkron, who had been born in Russia and grown up in Belarus, and then fled with his family, I think, fled to Austria after the Russian Revolution when he was still only a late teenager, I'm pretty sure. Because he was about my father's age. And he was teaching economic history, and he made quite a name for himself. He was a big picture guy who inspired his students to write small picture books, but he didn't do it. He was always, the big story, which was good for me because that's me. I was always the big story too. And
what was his name?
Alexander Gerschenkron, G-E-R. Oh boy, I think the other day I wrote it out on a piece of paper.
Okay, I found it. It's Gerschenkron.
Yes, Gerschenkron, exactly. And so he convinced me right in my first semester that I should major in economic history, which was a good compromise because that's a big step in Galbraith's direction, because a lot of his books are in fact economic history, like about the Great Depression, for example. So I was very happy to make that change and to have my objective be not to solve some mathematical equation that allegedly gave us an insight into economics, but to write a book that allegedly gave us some insight into economics. I thought that was a much better deal. Of course, I hadn't written a book at all ever at that point, and I didn't appreciate how hopelessly long it would take me and how overwhelmed I would feel doing it. But I was excited about it at that point. He was a fierce anti-communist, which may be why I raised his name in the first place. And the Harvard Economics Department had been also the same. It had dismissed two or three it had not kept as faculty two or three very talented, progressive, and in some cases a Communist Party member economists, and it did not keep a couple of very progressive but not communist economists in my class. Anyway, he and several other very brilliant but very progressive, anti-accepted covenant economists were not given tenure, and they were a couple of years ahead of me, most of them, and they all went to UMass Amherst, which was a new university at that time, and started a very, very progressive economics department, which continues to be so today. Pretty close to the only one in the whole country, except for some small colleges. Sam Bowles, his father, Chester Bowles, was in the Roosevelt administration. I think he may have been in charge of rationing during World War II. And I have an uncle on my father's side who was number 2 person in charge of wage and price controls during World War II. Don't ask me his name, or I'll have to pick it up in 10 minutes. Wallen, Peter Wallen. His son is Josh Wallen, and he is, I think, Peter Wallen, Wallen. Yeah, so I get more and more focused on economic history, but this necessarily involves other topics in economics, some of which I get involved with and even make what some people consider to be worthwhile contributions to. But over my entire career as an academic economist, in addition to a tiny little book, which is the first chapter of my dissertation, I think, which later got accepted as my whole dissertation, I did write a few articles, mostly, after I left Harvard, though, while I was teaching at Berkeley and Columbia. I always try to sort of keep in mind Leontief's ability to be a Nobel Prize winner in economics and still be skeptical about most of the, accepted conventional wisdom in economics. And so that's the way I tried to teach after I left Harvard. I tried to say, this is what the textbook says, but, and Leontief was really good because he gave exam questions which proved the point if you got the right answer. One thing in economics is, demand curves go down as prices go up, and supply curves go up as prices go up. But he gave an example where the supply curve goes up for a while and then it goes backwards. And the example is simple. He says, okay, suppose you're a working person with a family, and you need to work so many hours to pay the rent and feed everybody. You need to make so many more hours to have savings for retirement and vacations. And here is what you get paid per hour. How many hours would you work? And actually, in fact, just like that, how many hours would you work at different amounts of pay is the question. And he shows the different amounts of pay. And of course, the answer is if you can make enough to meet those needs, if wages are so high that you can make enough to meet those needs in less than a 10-hour day or an 8-hour day, you do it. So as the wage goes up, the supply of labor goes backwards. In his question, and it seems we have reached that point only just now in the real world in America, that as wages go up, the supply of labor goes down, because people don't need any more money. It's finally they get a good wage. Anyway, that was the classic kind of Leontief question. The others were also equally good, but that one was
Vasily Leontief.
That was Vasily Leontief. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you're good. You do your research while you listen.
Yes.
Okay.
Trying to circumvent the call quality here. So just trying to.
Yeah. So that, yes. Okay. So that's pretty much Harvard. I guess while I was in Harvard, the things I was mostly involved with were against the war in Vietnam. And that was also true when I was at Berkeley, and also true when I was at Columbia, because it was a long war. But I was also involved in protest movements when I was at Harvard against the invasion of Haiti. Invasion X out of 2000. But it was yet another invasion. And I believe also when I was a graduate student, an armed intervention in the Dominican Republic, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I don't think it could be the Dominican Republic. It must be. I'm not sure. But there were some other Latin American issues, and the United States was much more actively intervening all over Latin America then than it is now. So I remember speaking at several, what did they call those gatherings? They're kind of like rallies, but in university lecture halls.
Were you at teaching at Columbia during the university protests in '68?
I was. I was indeed. I was only at Berkeley for 1 year, which I think was 65, 66. I was at Columbia for 3 years, and the middle one was the year of the sit-ins or walkout. They weren't really sit-ins; they were walkouts. People just walked out of class. That was interesting. I mean, people knew my sympathy with the position that the university was basically being run by people that, well, I don't know. There's so many things to say about Columbia, but I discovered, and everybody else discovered, that Standard Oil of California, previously, the United Standard Oil of New Jersey, was the biggest donor to the university and had the biggest voice in what the university did, especially who were hired to be its president. And its president, in turn, was on the board of directors of Standard Oil of California, a job which made him far more money than being president of the university. This is all stuff that I hadn't realized either, and it came to light not because it was published in the Wall Street Journal, but because in 1968, in the sit-in, students sat in the president's office, and they were not very polite about it. They smoked his cigars and they read his files. And so, of course, they didn't have to look very far in his files before they found Standard Oil of New Jersey, this, that, and the other thing. So some of it, of course, was public information. I think the university probably did list its largest donors, but no, it didn't actually. It kept it a secret. It didn't have to do it in those days. So almost all of it was a surprise.
And what was was there a relationship between the Standard Oil and revelations and the war in Vietnam, or any other things that are going on at that time?
Well,
the military.
The university, like a lot of universities, had taken a very conservative view on everything from the civil rights movement to the war. And on the war, the president himself had said it was every fit individual's duty to join the military or be drafted and fight in the war. So he'd been very, very outspoken about his views in his role, but speaking, in his role as president of the university. So he'd essentially put the university behind the war. When he finally got fired, his successor immediately apologized for that and said it wasn't appropriate. But everybody, it wasn't just him. President of Harvard, president of Yale, president of just about every place. Same thing. Places like Antioch College were afraid to do anything that might be illegal about informing. I tried to get them to refuse to. They did that, actually. I take it back. They did agree not to inform the draft department of the names of the graduate and contact information for people in the graduating class. That was before I graduated. But they stuck to it, and nobody ever succeeded in making them stop. So they weren't the only school, but I can't remember the other ones. Mostly private liberal arts school colleges. Did you join the students in the protests at all, or were you
out there in the throngs in the melee at all in '68?
Okay. So the first act of the protest was to walk out of classrooms and school buildings. Mm-hmm. I offered to keep teaching people on, and of course I had always talked about progressive political issues in all my classes because there was plenty of room to do in all my classes. And so I taught a class outside until the buildings were. The second break point was that buildings were occupied. So first they were abandoned and then they were occupied. So I actually provided my key to let them into the building where my office was. and I joined a number of protest rallies and marches. It all happened so fast that the first thing I remember clearly is when the police came, the New York City police, after the buildings had been occupied for maybe a little less than 2 weeks, maybe 10 days, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I happened to still be on campus. It was early evening. I happened to be wearing my professor clothes, a sport jacket and I think a tie. And there were students and a few junior faculty standing in front of the entrances to the buildings that the police were massing around. They had been occupied, including the administration building where the president's office was, which had been already occupied inside. So I stood on a platform with many other, mostly students, graduate and undergraduate students, when the police, came marching up to the stairs. And I regret that I wasn't more confident and that I didn't walk down the stairs and talk to the captain in charge of the troops and say that this was civil disobedience, and if he wanted to arrest us all, I think we would all be happy to go to jail, but we wanted to show our opposition to police force being used to settle a campus dispute. But I didn't do that. I just stood up there with everybody else, and he read the riot act 3 times, and then, boom, people came jumping off the roof, policemen, and 2 or 3 of them landed on the entrance, the top, the kind of entranceway that maybe 40 of us were standing in. And one of them hit me 3 times on the head with his billy club. So I got 36 stitches. And obviously, that was enough to get me off the stairs into the infirmary, where I got all those stitches, which barbers kept commenting on for the next 5 or 10 years, 10 years, I think. Sometime after that, I got to be really well known because there weren't that many professors. And it was either sometime after that or sometime before that I also went with a group of students to Dow Chemical's offices. And the Dow Chemical was 67, but they were both in the spring, I think. I had a graduate student who was very progressive. And he was my teaching assistant, my first teaching assistant in the 3 years I was at Columbia. And I got to be good friends with he and his wife, along with a lot of other progressive graduate students and a few other progressive undergraduate students. And so, we talked a lot about doing different things. And he came up with the idea that when Dow Chemical came to the campus to recruit, we should go to Dow Chemical's office in Rockefeller Center to protest their making of napalm bombs that were being used with horrible, horrible effects in Vietnam. So some of the most terrifying pictures from Vietnam, pictures of children burning and running, burning to death because of napalm, which was dropped indiscriminately on villages and farmlands and cities. It was just another bomb, kind of the bomb of first choice. So we took the subway, I'm pretty sure, to Government Center, and we went to it's a Rockefeller Center. Sorry, and when we got into the elevator, there was Lieutenant Flanagan, who it was afterwards, because there was Lieutenant Flanagan, who I already knew from at least 3 instances. One was the sit-in at Columbia. One was the police attack on the sit-in at Columbia. One was a walkout from the graduation ceremony in the church, in the campus church, by those of us who wanted to protest the use of the police on campus. And the last one was Rockefeller Center. So he was the head of the New York City Police Red Squad. Every big city in America had a Red Squad. Cambridge had one, Boston had one, New York had one, Philadelphia had one, Cleveland had one. I'm pretty sure it was every place. So there, we go up the elevator, and what I now knew how to recognize a mile away, 2 plainclothes policemen get on with us. You could. They all wear the same clothes. They all have these little bands with their lapels, so they can recognize each other. They all look the same anyway. Anyway, we get to the top, all 28 of us, I think, or so. And, of course, the police, having known we were coming, have already told Dow Chemical to bolt its door and pull the shade. So there's no way we're going to get in the door. Mm-hmm. But the lobby, I thought, was public space. We weren't trespassing to be in the lobby. But up comes the building manager and Lieutenant Flanagan, and they read us the riot act that we're trespassing, and if we don't leave, we'll be arrested. So of course we don't leave, and of course we get arrested. Mm-hmm. And we all get into a paddy wagon. There's a picture of me that was taken by the campus newspaper and used in that interview that the guy from British Broadcasting did about a year ago. Have you seen that?
Oh, no.
Well, it's all about me because it's half about me. It's about the origins of socially responsible investing, and the interview. It's about a 15-minute interview with me and a 15 interview with the other guy, whose name is Robert White, and who's not alive anymore, and it wasn't alive then. He made it about 2 years ago. If you just look up Robert Zevin BBC interview, I think you'll get it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's very short. I mean,
okay.
And so then the next protest was graduation. It's a very large number of us, because to protest basically the administration calling in the police to do something on campus. That was what we were protesting, and I would say maybe 20% of the graduate students and 5 or 10% of the faculty, and quite a few students even who were graduating all walked out. And we had our own graduation ceremony and our own speeches outdoors, about a quarter-mile walk from the cathedral. And so Flanagan and his troops were there, ex-policemen wearing the same lapels, so they could recognize each other. Well, I guess it's worth just telling a little story that's much before Columbia, and that is I was still at Antioch, beginning to invest $3,000 every year worth of gold stock that we were given and encouraged to sell and reinvest. And I think I may have talked about some of that in the previous meeting, but one time I came across this guy who was doing a project in Maryland. Did I talk about that already?
No, you haven't.
He was a guy who had done limited partnerships. Is not quite differs from common stock in that you can't buy it and sell it.
Okay.
So you kind of hang on to it, and for tax reasons also you kind of, I don't want to say stuck with it, but it's kind of optimal to keep it until you die, in terms of taxes because of the way it works. So he was selling interest to build a community in the middle of Maryland, halfway between Baltimore and Washington, which he intended to be a sort of ideal community in that it would be integrated to a much greater extent than either Baltimore or Washington came even close to being, and that it would be environmentally friendly, and that it would be user friendly, and that that there would be it was intended to be, and it is now, a little over 100,000 people divided into 6 neighborhoods, each of which has its market, its own movie theater, its own meeting place. And I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, this was the model. It looked very interesting to me. I mentioned it to my father. He said, always a bad idea to try to mix investing to get rich and investing to do good. And it was much more sensible, in his opinion, to get rich and then take the proceeds and use those to do good. And, there was a conflict if you're trying to do both at once. So, knowing almost nothing and having very little experience about investing, I took his word for it. And just to make that long story short, it continues to be an extraordinarily successful, thriving community, and it produced more than competitive return to the people that invested in it. The town is called Columbia, Maryland.
Oh, Columbia. Okay, interesting. Okay.
And the guy's name is James Rouse, Rouse. The current population breakdown is 43% white, 27% African American, 13% Asian, 10% Hispanic. It's a completely integrated community, of which there are very, 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 very few in all of America. So, and it was the investors got more than a competitive return, partly because people like my father didn't want to invest in it. So the people who were willing to stick their necks out got an extra good return. So I went into the investment business. First, I just started investing for myself, and after a while, for my mother and father and sister. Someplace in there, I decided I had some expenses. I needed to publish them. One of the world's first programmable computers made by Strick, the truck company of all people. And I had a part-time secretary, and I had all of the horrors of New York State regulation of everybody who thought they had a business to run. So I started charging. But at the same time, I also involved with my activities against the war in Vietnam. And the first organization that I started in 1967 was Resist, which was a long story. But just to make it quick and short, I was inspired by the ad which the French intellectual had run opposing the French war against the Algerians, a war of occupation, basically, signed by, famous French authors and scientists and so on. So I thought, well, let's do the same thing. And I wrote a draft, and I shared it widely with people that I thought would be very interested, or that I thought would be very useful because they had won Nobel Prizes, or they were well-known authors. And I would say maybe a third of the people that I wrote to had something to do with world publishing. They had a book published by World or something like that. So they recognized my name. And maybe another third was through people that I knew were themselves, or I'd been told were themselves activists, anti-war activists. And some of them I knew, and some of them I just knew of. And so I wrote to them, and they reached out. Anyway, one way or another, with a lot of feedback from people and a lot of changes in the text on my part to make them happy, we finally had a draft that I asked people to sign, and it was the call to resist a legitimate authority, and it was signed by about 225 people when it appeared as an ad. I think in the New York Times, but it may have been the Wall Street Journal, because the New York Times wouldn't take it. When it appeared, we had a press conference in New York, and some of the speakers were a number of people who were well known because they'd written, popular books, or they were very successful authors. Some people who were well known because they were Nobel Prize winning economists or scientists, and quite a few Nobel Prize winners actually signed it, because that's where it was aiming. It tried to duplicate, the French thing, which was signed by people that everybody knew who they were. So after that, I had invited everybody who wanted to come for lunch at the Columbia Faculty Club and form a new organization, which we called Resist, to support people who were doing what we were asking them to do, which is resisting the war, by not paying their taxes, by not, refusing to be drafted, by refusing to go to Vietnam if they were drafted, and so on. It was quite successful. It was so successful, actually, that the Justice Department sued seven of the people who signed it. Not me. I was disappointed to say, because my name didn't appear prominently anywhere. I was, one more name, and I didn't, play a prominent role in the press conference. But so that was a famous trial in San Francisco, of all places, and the jury we asked for a jury trial, and the jury acquitted them, saying, this is free speech, which was the main argument that we used. And Resist grew very rapid in those first three, in the second, third, and fourth year, when the war was still going strong. I think we were funding well over 100 anti-war organizations across the United States, which to me seemed like a staggeringly big number.
Mm-hmm. And what year was that that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that the call was published in. I'm kind of torn between 1959 and 1962. I'm sorry.
Okay. No worries. No worries.
But the war was going strong, and I think the war did go strong at least until 1962, maybe longer. I just don't remember anymore. I think until the late 60s, really, yeah. I'm sorry, I've got my dates all wrong. But anyway, it was very, very successful. And because of that success, after the first year, so the first year I got the first year was 1967, and now it's clear to me.
A Call to Resist Illegitimate Authority was published in the New York Review of Books, October 12th, 1967. There we go.
Good. So the Times wouldn't take it, and I think we thought the Wall Street Journal was the wrong audience. So the New York Review of Books, I've forgotten that. But several other newspapers reprinted it. Later, I think like the San Francisco Chronicle, and maybe even the Boston Globe. I don't remember exactly who they were. So 1 year later, in 1968, there was a sit-in at Columbia about a number of issues, but many of them were related to the war and Columbia's role in different ways in supporting the war. So, the issues were things like letting Dow Chemical recruit on campus, even though they made napalm, or letting the military recruit on campus, things like that. ROTC, they were all part of the list, but there were a lot of things on the list that were about racial discrimination in Columbia's backyard too. And that was basically took over buildings and closed them or occupied them. So, but anyway, one thing that came out of that was I met a guy named Fred Gardner who was already in touch with 2 or 3 coffee houses that had been started outside military bases to support GIs who were opposed to the war.
Right.
And he asked me if I would do something to increase support and organizing of more coffee houses. And of course, I said yes. And so I created another organization called the United States Servicemen Fund, with a lot of help from the law center in New York, the name of which I'm also forgetting. And we incorporated as a tax-exempt organization to provide services to enlisted servicemen, just like the UFO. We didn't mention that our bias was going to be against the war, but the UFO's bias was for the war. So it seemed us 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of tax exemption. So
you were the not anti-USO, but you were the alternative USO.
Yes. And so I was really busy with that I was the head of it the first year and a half or so, unlike Resist, which I found somebody else to run from the beginning. It took more time because it wasn't just looking at some group that was doing anti-war protests in Milwaukee, but looking at some group that was building a new base in Fort Dix. Building a new coffee house, outside Fort Dix, and having a hell of a time doing it because the military was determined, not to let these things exist, and doing everything they could to sabotage it or kill it, and the local police as well, of course. So that kept me busy, but it also successful because in the end, I believe there were 13 or 14 anti-war GI coffee houses just in the United States. And we found entertainers, or entertainers found us who wanted to go around to these bases and sing folk songs. Keith Seeger was one, of course, but many others that I had never heard of before, who had similar progressive political views and anti-war views, and also entertainers. And the entertainment kind of reached its peak in the 3rd and 4th year when the war was getting close to an end, when Jane Fonda and her then boyfriend, the Canadian actor whose name I'm forgetting.
Yeah, the FTA tour, and we talked about this last time. I ended up finding it. It's on. They actually have the FTA documentary on Netflix, and they have a new.
We talked about
a new restored version too. I guess that's looks really nice that you can purchase. You can look that up. I'll put links along with this. So we can that has the whole cast and everything too. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm off track, and especially since I'm doing things we already did. I'm supposed to be talking about how I got
right into socially responsible investing, and so out of all of the anti-war stuff, the Vietnam War eventually, 74. Nixon started pulling. I forget when Nixon started pulling out troops, or when the fall of Saigon was. Was it 74? But so basically, like mid 70s, Vietnam War is over. So what did you pivot to then, or how did that start to turn into your responsible in investing?
Yeah, well, let me back up.
Sure.
The time period I was in is the time period where it begins, and I just forgot to talk about it.
Yeah.
So since I was doing reasonably well investing money for my sisters and a few colleagues, and well, that's not the right place to start. One of my useful things that I could do that other people weren't in a position to do, either because of what they knew or who they knew or where they were, to go try to raise money for people in New York.
Got it.
Who might be sympathetic to resist, and then to the Servicemen. And the Servicemen's Fund was a much steeper sell, because people thought they were really going to, because they were going to get thrown in jail basically for encouraging GIs to disobey orders or refuse to be drafted or whatever it might be. But the first one was an easier sell. Just to make noise against the war, or maybe to refuse to pay your own taxes if you're an individual. So I started out trying to raise money to resist, and then a year later I added the Servicemen's Fund to my kit bag, and I was basically looking around for people who I had some reason to believe had progressive or anti-war sympathies, and for some reason I had reason to believe had some money. And for the life of me, I can't remember exactly where that information came from, but obviously a lot of it comes from somebody who knows somebody, and then somebody else who knows somebody else. And, one way or another, between students and faculty members, I had enough people that I could 2 or 3 times a month be visiting in their person. Not a huge number, and they were people that had a fair amount of wealth, and a lot of them also central. Anyway, so I would go to their houses, I'd make an appointment, I'd call them up, or write them, make an appointment, typically go to meet them at their houses in the evening, and I was 31 years old, and 31, 32 years old, and I probably looked even younger, and so people looked kind of surprised when I came through the door, and I had to tell them who I was and what I did, and one of the things I told them, because I had just begun doing it, was that, that in addition to what I did at Columbia, in addition to Servicemen's Fund and Resist, I had also started a small investment company. And let's say it was 3 people a month, 36 people a year. Let's say maybe 10 or 20% of those people said, "What? Person with your politics? You're an investment advisor? I'd love to have you manage my money." Just like that. I was blown away. I thought, kind of a fool you don't know anything about me. And which I tried to say politely, because I really thought, and they said, no, that's right. I trust you. I like you. It was kind of the spirit of the 60s, the credentials, especially credentials, and were not to be trusted. Titles were not to be trusted. Go by your gut feeling about somebody. So these were all people very much in that spirit. Although they were almost all of them older than I was, which means they were quite a bit older than the youth movement that was going on. But they weren't, anyway, I don't remember how old they all were. I think of the typical one as being maybe late 40s or early 50s versus my early 30s. But that's what they said, and so that's what I did. They wanted it, I did it. And when I said I would do it, they said, but there's some things I don't want to own. And the list was basically, I think we did this already too, but this is where it belongs. I don't want to own stocks that do companies that do strip mining. I don't want to. Most people didn't want to own oil and gas. Some people anyway didn't want to own oil and gas. I don't want to own companies that make toxic fertilizers. I don't want to own. So anyway, they had
like Dow Chemical, napalm. Yeah, they didn't want to own.
Dow Chemical was definitely on the list.
Yeah.
And defense contractors were on the list, and polluters were on the list. And I said, well, in the spirit of the age, I really believe, you used to be the one that decides what you do and don't own in your portfolio, which was already considered a heretical thing for an investment manager to say. But this was not so heretical. I think you probably won't do as well if you put restrictions on your range of choices. And they said, I don't care. I don't want to own those companies, whether I don't do as well or not. So that's how I got to associate responsible investment manager without believing in it at all. I was still hearing my father's voice, basically saying, it's a conflict. Making money and doing good, are at odds with each other. But here I had this plant, which grew to be maybe, I don't know, it grew in different ways, but it grew from the same active on my part, even after I left Columbia and moved to Boston. It kept growing, even in the New York area, because almost nobody else was doing it. As you saw in that video, there was one other guy, Bob White, who was doing it at the Amalgamated Bank in New York. But
Robert Schwartz?
We were the only, yes.
Yeah.
As far as I know, we were the only two doing it anywhere. At least until we were succeeding and making a dent that other people noticed, and then they were quick to try to follow. But my experience.
And did you know Robert Schwartz, or had you heard of him when you started?
Well, this is really embarrassing. I mean, I knew that somebody ran against Lindsay for his congressional seat in New York in those days on an anti-war ticket, and I probably knew his name, but it never rang a bell.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that when I went to meetings of the American Economic Association, I belonged to a group that opposed nuclear weapons, and he was the chair of that group, but I didn't pay much attention to him because I didn't know him. I didn't even remember his name. And I didn't know he had anything to do with socially responsible investing, whether he was the person, that other people were going to. And I even talked to someone, I think it's probably, even though she's dead and her husband's dead, I think it's probably confidential what her name is. But I knew her son very well because he and his family lived in Lincoln. And my parents knew her husband very well because he had lived in Cleveland for quite a while. And he was also quite a famous man. And they were divorced, and she said she had taken her money to somebody whose name went in one ear and out the other.
Oh, okay.
At Amalgamated Bank. But of course, that's who it was.
Yep.
And I was suspicious and saying, well, he's probably just doing it because he knows that, he knows his success. Anyway, whatever it was, she stayed with him.
You didn't think he was the real deal. You suspected that whoever he was, he wasn't for real.
And it was absolute complete ignorance and hubris on my part because I actually did know him, and I had no reason at all not to think he was good, but I didn't even know his name.
Yeah.
But after about 5 years of really very good performance, probably better than any 5 years I've had since. My first 5 years were really good. I began to think, well, how come I told these people I couldn't do as well and I'm doing better than the market? And I began to think about it and decided that the diversification didn't really mean that you had to own every stock in the whole market. That there were maybe 5 or 10 or 12 or 20 factor components of the market return, and as long as you had an appropriate amount of exposure to each one of them, you could do more or less the same as the market. And but I was accumulating evidence for this without having access to a really high-powered computer or to a really high-powered database. But my little experiments kind of bore me out that if you owned one steel company, it was just as good as owning all the steel companies almost. And the same thing for, those kinds of things is what I was doing. But I was that it was correct, and it turns out it was correct. And so, in particular, I got involved in the South Africa investment. I think I was already in those first 5 years, but I got more involved over time, and partly because of the headquarters of the sort of anti-apartheid movement in America, run by a South African in exile, was in Boston, so I knew them all pretty well. And actually, he and I went and spoke at some universities together. Then I hired to do a more exacting test on whole S&P 500 with and without all the companies that did business in South Africa, which was a lot of companies, like 120 out of the 500, and it was like, I think something like 7 or 8 out of the top 10, the biggest 10 companies. So it was it was 120 out of 500 by number of companies, but it was more like 40 or 45% of market capitalization of the whole index. And he found, as I suspected, that you could do just exactly as well without any of them. You just own the rest, weighted by market value. You ended up doing just the same. Not every single month, not every single quarter, not even every single year, but every 5 or 10 years, exactly the same. And this has been tested over and over by different people, and it's been confirmed, was tested over and over and confirmed by them, although they kept it a secret because they didn't want to offend their clients, the big clients who were doing this in South Africa. But they knew it too, way back, and they kept saying it was not true. So that's how I started. I from being a skeptic to being kind of surprised that it was working out well, to finding and orchestrating wider search to prove that it made no difference. Now, does that mean that nothing makes any difference? No, of course not. If you take out the whole oil and gas sector, you pretty much do. If you have a contemporary socially responsible investment, it does make a very noticeable difference. Not in the long-term return, which is better, because oil and gas has been in the doghouse for the last 20 or 30 years. But in every month, every quarter, every year, you're going to be better or worse by a not fairly substantial, but meaningful 1 or 2% difference, which to the people who play this game is a huge number. I mean, they want to be 0.001% or minus whatever the S&P does.
Right.
Every day, every month, every quarter, every year. So for them, it's a big number. But it's not a negative number
because it evens out over time.
It's better over time.
Oh, better over time.
The bad times are bigger than the good times. But the good times or the bad times, either one of them lasts for 3 or 4 years.
And why do you think that is? Like just from a performance point of view, like what is the explanation for why it actually ends up doing better?
Oh, it's pretty simple. I mean, every time there's a crisis in the Middle East or a crisis in some other supply side, oil, gas, and this was especially true in the 1980s when there were 2 embargoes imposed by Middle Eastern oil producers themselves. But every time there's any kind of shortage from any kind of disaster or political movement, oil companies and oil and gas companies and even coal companies do better. And unlike almost every other industry, now that we really appreciate what's going on, there's really no oil or gas-related company or coal-related company that any socially responsible investor would own. Although some people claim some people, especially if they have, indexes listed, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, claim that, their oil company.
Right.
But
clean coal.
It's the same idea. So, but that's, that wasn't true in the case of South Africa. there were oil companies that were there and oil companies that weren't there, auto companies that were there and auto companies that weren't there. Maybe all the cigarette companies were there. I'm not sure. And, I mean, like Coca-Cola was there, and Pepsi wasn't. I mean, there were a lot of it. So not owning South Africa, not owning oil and gas is easy if you're a long-term investor. In the long term, it's consistently doing worse. But if you really want to look as if you're equal to the market every single period, there may be prolonged periods when doesn't work.
So, and so, how long before other institutions started catching up and started divesting? I mean, were you kind of on that same wave, or was there a lag between when you started to pull South Africa out of your managed investments and when other institutions started to catch on and pull out as well?
Yeah, there was a lag. I think most of the I don't remember the dates very well about any of it, but some of the first people to do it were foundations that had progressive agendas, because they were less likely to be under the influence of a major donor or a bank or some very. I mean, if they were progressive foundations, they weren't going to be subject to the whims of very pro-business or very conservative participants. So it was easiest for them, but it was still a hard sell. And I think the very first people to do it were some of the progressive foundations, but even they were still like one on whose board I served in New York, with some, I wish I could remember the name of it. I should have found my resume and had it in front of me for this. The New World Foundation was a very progressive foundation with a long record of progressive politics, and I met them when I went to try to persuade them to divest. And about 2 weeks later, they said, "We're not going to divest, but we're really impressed with you. We'd like you to join our board." I did. I went on their board for a 6-year term, and then for another year or two, because of some scramble they had with other members. They was normally 1 6-year term for everybody, and I was their treasurer. But even so, I still couldn't persuade them to divest. And now I'm trying to remember what the years were. It overlaps Clinton's presidency in part. I think he may have been. Yeah, Hillary Clinton had been on the board, maybe the chair of the board, just a year or two before he was elected, and I went on the board shortly after that. So it was basically all during Clinton's 2 terms that I'm talking about, like from the end of the first year to the end of the.
So in the 90s, they still weren't pulling out of South African investment. They still weren't divesting.
Yeah, it took a long time.
Wow.
And a few very progressive. It's not even. Trying to really think of the people who did it first, but it doesn't. The people who did it first were religious organizations, and it was sometimes groups of nuns, sometimes men. I'm trying to think of the male equivalent of a nun, not priests, but brothers, I guess, in most cases. And I think first diocese to do it, Minneapolis, and that's well into the 90s already. The Catholic bishops, no, that's a different thing. That was nuclear weapons. It took the church a long time, but some Catholic orders and some, especially nunneries, who belong, who were part of a group of religious organizations that belong to this organization that I keep forgetting the name of. It's across the street from Columbia in New York.
I can always find it out later, put it in there. So yeah.
Yeah. Tim Smith was the executive director of it for 30 or 40 years of this.
Okay.
They were very active with resolutions aimed at companies which they could get by the trustees much more easily than divestments, which the trustees thought would hurt performance. So the divestment was very slow going. It was small and super progressive foundations like Resist. They really didn't have much of an endowment, or an occasional order like a nunnery or whatever the male movement is. And I think it was, again, only until the early 90s that big Catholic organizations, the one that I know best is Catholic Healthcare West, which ran Catholic hospitals up and down the state of California and maybe, above in the north and the west as well. I remember they finally did it in the early 90s. They were one of the first. Unions also finally started to do it in the late 80s, early 90s, especially those who were kind of CIO rather than AFL oriented, were more working class than elite class. So the mine workers and the auto workers did it. They were among the first. And then a number of smaller, very progressive, like the machinists, I think, also did it. But that was all, again, in the very end of the 80s or in the early 90s, not before. So once I've been doing that for another 5 years, on top of the previous 5 years, not to mention the sort of gap in between, I said to myself, hey, this is just like other schools. It's not making any difference. We could do just as well, or in case, fortunately, more often than not better, without owning any of these things. Even though, for example, that's a story than South Africa, but, one of the illustrations people would often throw at me was that the best performing stock in the S&P 500 from the end of World War II until whatever day we were talking about, at least up until the government, slammed it through the book at the cigarette companies, was Philip Morris. Absolutely far and away the number one stock. So the question was, how could you do as well as the S&P 500 if you didn't own the number one best stock? And the answer was, well, you don't also own a lot of the number 70 and 90 and minus 300 stocks that didn't do well, that dragged you down. So Philip Morris did better, but Philip Morris wasn't the S&P 500. Philip Morris was just a tiny little piece of it. But for a while, I scratched my head about that. It seemed like kind of a curveball that I couldn't quite get my bat, reach with my bat, but it wasn't. Now I'm lost. Where are we?
Well, so socially responsible investing. When was the Calvert Fund or the Calvert Group established?
Yeah,
because that was the first mutual fund that anybody could buy into.
It was, although some religious organizations claim to have things that were similar in some respects, and they were, but none of them had anything like inclusive sweep of the Calvert. Exceptions, exceptions if they were known. So I'm trying to think when that was. I think it's early 1980s, but that doesn't sound quite right.
So 76 was Calvert Funds, right? Was Calvert Investments was 76. So was it?
Okay.
Was it established specifically for socially responsible, or was it? Did it transition into it?
They had a money market fund. They had a money market fund. So and Calvert was the first. It was the next thing, but it was about 5 years later or something, or maybe more. And it's funny. I can remember all the details, but I can't remember the dates. So the details are that one of the co-founders of Calvert and I were both on the board of a startup. This helps a little bit with the date. On a startup internet company in the earliest days of the internet, long before there were desktop computers even. And company was a flop, but partly because it wasn't very clever about exploiting the fact that it actually had invented both the ideas of Windows and the name of Windows. And years later, one of the other directors said to me, we should sue Microsoft for stealing our patent because we were an established registered company and we had Windows was our product, basically. It never crossed my mind then. Anyway, so that I think that must have been early 1980s.
And what was this Wayne Silby or
Wayne Silby? Yes,
Wayne Silby. Okay,
it was Wayne Silby. Yeah, and so that's how we met. And I remember recommending another venture capital startup to him, which bust, and for which he never stopped riddling me, which we both invested in. I can't remember what it was anymore. But it was supposed to be another kind of internet company. It may have been that's what we were directors of. It was same company. We both invested in it.
What was the name?
Was some clever. What was then a clever name? Like Windows. I think it was called Windows.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I could try to find it, but that was their great idea, which was only their idea. But so it's of interest only because this story only because that's where I met Wayne Silby. And then, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years later, I took a cab to New York, and was it New York? Yeah, it must have been New York. I took a cab to New York, and there was Wayne Silby in the same line. So I said, "Where are you going?" And he said he was going to brokerage house in Midtown Manhattan. I said, "Well, I'm going to Midtown Manhattan too." I said, "Why are you going to the brokerage house?" He said, "Well, we're thinking of starting a mutual fund, stocks. I wanted to get the brokerage house to manage it." I said, "No, that's what I do." And we're a socially responsible investment firm. I invented it. And sure enough, after going through their idiotically stiff and the goofiest presentation, which I've been through a couple of times since then with other clients, Wayne came to me and said, "Well, how would you do it?" And so we became. We was then United States Trust Company, Boston. We became the first manager of the Calvert Social Investment Fund, the whole portfolio. And so this is, I think, 1980s, right? Yeah, I think Halbert was 82.
Yeah, that rings a bell. And
because at least looking up Wayne Silby, he attended some Buddhist conference which talked about right livelihood, and he was inspired. I mean, that's the lore.
Yes, no, he said that frequently. And actually, somebody else who later became the head of the advisory committee to Calvert, who lives in the Boston area, whose name I'm also forgetting, I think met Wayne there. They met each other there. He was kind of a full-time guru. He seemed to do anything else except, provide his wisdom to organizations like Calvert. Where he chaired the advisory committee, which had been created at my advice, so that there would be people who were active in different fields like anti-war or environment or labor relations, who could form a committee to review the social screens to keep the bad people out. I think they still run it. I'm not sure. And he chaired that committee. This guy, his name I'm forgetting.
Well, it might come back. No worries. So Calvert was the first fund that was, anyone could invest in. And so that really kind of kickstarted SRIs, socially responsible investment, kind of on the radar of, regular investors that weren't just, your own private clients. What's the through line from socially responsible investing now to what are called ESGs? Environment, social, and governmental funds.
Yeah, well, as you said, social investing grew quite a bit from then until the beginning of this century, all of which is pretty much omitted histories that the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times give you. The history of socially responsible investing, it sort of starts in 2000. But in fact, it started, as we've seen, a long time before that. And it grew quite rapidly and steadily. First by word of mouth, and by especially the South African movement. I think especially important because it was so broad based. I mean, it was obviously people who were progressive, and but it was also the whole African American community and civil rights community. But it was a lot broader than the anti-war movement, or than most social justice movements, for that matter. And and of course, so the existing socially responsible investing movement was growing at the same time and becoming more visible. And there'd be a little op-ed story in local paper in Cleveland or Milwaukee or Seattle, and there would be op-eds once in a while, and Calvert, as it was growing, began to advertise. I think it was maybe the first company to advertise socially responsible investing in newspapers, and then of course much later on television. But the anti-war movement itself, I think, stirred up a lot of interest in how to overthrow the capitalist grasp of the American government. And in the 60s, especially, people were extremely, and in my view, correctly skeptical about the benevolence and honesty of American governance at all levels and in all departments. And so the idea that you could put your money where your mouth was became kind of more attractive. It was a hard stretch to say that if you put your money in the Cabot Social Investment Fund, it would hasten the reform of capitalism, the fall of capitalism. But it wasn't a hard stretch to say at least you won't be doing any harm. Or you'll be, or more carefully put, you'll be doing less harm.
Right, harm reduction,
measurably less harm. So the 60s was the firepower behind that, and then 70s and 80s. A lot of it was just by momentum. A lot of it was just, I think, as it happens, those were the 2 decades in which a whole generation of entrepreneurs who made their fortune either during World War II or in the immediate aftermath of World War II had children who were coming of age. And that generation that came of age in the 70s and 80s was again, particularly progressive, as were a lot of people in the 60s. And they were, in my experience, doing my job at U.S. Trust, people were coming and saying, my father, wouldn't let me do this, but now that I'm 21, I really like to take the money away from the bank where he has been managing it or having it managed and have you do it. That was like a broken record. I heard it so many times. Maybe a little more often from young women than from young men, but certainly quite often from both. And the other broken record that goes throughout the entire length of time I've been doing social investing are widows who feel finally relief in their husband's tyranny about investing and free to do socially responsible investing, which they've always wanted to, which they claim, probably correctly, they've always wanted to do. But that one is less fixed in time and less fixed on any particular generation. It's fixed on the husband dying, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And the wife being free to pursue this. And the same is true of children growing up. The children growing up and being able to do what they want is also a constant in the history of social responsible investing, at least until quite recently. I can't be sure about the last 10 years or so, but I suspect probably still. So,
and so
I left the road again.
No, that's all good. But basically, we went from, SRI, socially responsible investing, and now that's been eclipsed by ESG. And you talk a little bit in the Bloomberg interview about how ESGs are basically just a kind of perverse repackaging of SRIs, but actually do essentially the opposite of what they're supposed to do. Whereas it's mitigating the impact of externalities on the companies themselves, as opposed to mitigating the externalities of the companies on the rest of society. And so, I don't know if you want to say anything more about ESGs, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of, present at the execution, so I think I can describe it in some detail. But it's very often people who well, there are kind of three significant. There are more than three. There are four significant actors in this story. The easiest one to understand are the investment managers and brokerage houses that wanted to be in on the act because they could see that more and more of their clients were heading that way and were unhappy with it. So they obviously were looking for ways to get inside the circle and
the SRI circle.
The SRI circle. And so for the banks and the investment managers, one easy thing to do was to join the socially responsible investment forum, and they started to do that, and they started to come, and of course and they sent more than one person, but so did everybody else. So that's not particularly. But they started to come, and they started to stand up and talk about what they were doing, so that everybody would know. All the people they were competing against would know that they were a legitimate competitor, or think that they were a legitimate competitor. And they also began to hire people that expressed an interest or showed a talent and interest to do this, but it was mostly expressed an interest rather than they had a background doing it at the beginning. And so most of the people who were starting to do it were brokerage houses and banks, had not ever done it before. There were exceptions, but the banks I know in the banks I know in Boston, including Boston Trust, which is an investment bank. Investment is their business. Oh, come on.
Oh yeah, it looks like you.
Hello?
There we go. Yeah, I see you.
Yeah. They hired people straight out of. Well, sometimes they hired people from other firms, and sometimes they hired people straight out of graduate school. But in both cases, they were not people who'd ever done socially responsible investing,
right?
And they were learning from scratch. And of course, they would ask us, well, how do you do it? So later on, that was the beginning. At the beginning, there still weren't really any courses to take anywhere, I don't think,
right.
In socially responsible investing. So there wasn't any way people straight out of graduate school could have had more than a very brief and probably skeptical introduction from their business school professors. In fact, I could count the business school professors who thought it was a good idea, at least in the Boston area, on the fingers of one hand, pretty easily. Anyway, so the next thing was corporations, corporate funds, which we had been talking to, along with finally others, for quite a long time, and getting mostly apologetic explanations of why they couldn't do it. But in some cases, very angry responses from all or some of the board. But this was often the response from progressive labor union boards too, that said we can't afford to do it; it's too expensive. It's cost us money. Or most frequently of all, but usually not said so openly, but sometimes said openly. Our bank wouldn't like it if we did this. And that actually happened in a situation where I wasn't trying to sell my bank. I was just trying to sell a proposal to the New York City pension fund that which had 100% of its money managed by one of the five big banks, each of the five big banks in New York. And not one of them did better than the S&P 500. Not one of them did as well as the S&P 500. So I proposed, it's a long story, why I got called in there. It had nothing to do with the pension fund, but with a guy I knew and liked and who had been my student, who was in charge of an inquiry into what New York City should do about its default. He asked me to also do this, which was what should New York City do about how it's investing in the pension fund. So we went to visit them all, and I wrote a report which distinguished co-trustee didn't want to sign, but he was
at Calvert?
No, he was Peter Bernstein from the family that founded Bernstein and Company, but he had his own company, which was an advisory firm, and he was a good friend of mine. He became my good friend after that, but and we liked each other. But he felt he couldn't do it for the same reason everybody else, because he didn't want to seem antagonistic to his
piss off any banks,
investment company and bank clients. So my proposal was very simple. Give each of the banks, 20% of the money, keep track of performance, and after 5 years, pick any banks which have not done as well as the S&P 500 and reallocate something like 2% of their money to the S&P 500 index fund.
Mm-hmm.
And then on a 5-year moving average, do the same thing every year thereafter.
Mm.
They went crazy. I mean, the board, the union people on the board, one of whom was the father of a good friend of mine, they loved it. But banks went crazy and they killed it. Weirdly enough, they have votes on this. Maybe they don't have votes, but they threatened, stop doing business with the city. A threshold which the city, easily turned the other way around. With South Africa, the city just said, if you don't divest, we're going to stop doing business with you. And they all pulled out. First in Los Angeles, then in New York, then in Chicago, then in Houston, Texas. I mean, everywhere, same thing. The banks may be the investment managers may be the bank's biggest customer. I'm getting a little twisted around here.
Well, so
it's not inseparable.
Okay. So,
there are plenty of other ways.
Okay.
Investors.
Well, so SRIs, how did that turn into ESGs?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I keep detouring myself. To my way of thinking, what we were doing was an extension of social activism into the profession of money management, just as it had long since been extended into the profession of, practicing law or anything else. So, but most people who were in the business agreed. I think they were happy to identify it that way. And I think the goose that laid the golden egg is what killed the whole thing, because we were very successful. We were growing extremely fast. The Calvert Fund was, I think, by the end of the 1900s, about $1 billion, and U.S. Trust Company was about $3 billion in socially responsible investment firms accounts. And so the whole thing, including other banks and managers, presumably in the $20 to $30 billion range. I think somebody in London actually started to keep track of it then. And that was big enough, not huge still compared to the whole investment universe, but it was big enough to make other managers think that it was threatening them, and that and that plus customer feedback made them think that they had to get into this business. So they began looking for people to hire. Not every investment company, not every broker, and not every bank, few at a time, one by one.
So more and more of these companies started getting into it, and they didn't have the background.
But in the case of the banks, in addition to trying to do it in-house, they were also hiring investment management companies that already did it. And the response of other banks and brokers was to think that they better start doing it too, because it was a growing business and they needed to be part of it. So starting in the very late 90s and then accelerating, in the early 2000s, a lot of banks began to say, well, we do socially responsible investing in our trust department too, and we can do it for you. And it's true now that, a very great many some banks were very stubborn, and some brokers were very stubborn, but most of them came around. Although the brokers were slower, I think, than the banks. And I'm not quite sure why, but I think most of the brokers didn't start to do it until well after 2010, rather than well after 2000. I think they're a good full 10 years later. Not everybody, of course, but the biggest banks. And of course, they all had this problem of not wanting to insult the firms that they weren't going to invest in, but that they wouldn't be able to invest in. And many of them tried to get around it by saying, we do socially responsible investing, but then kind of figuring out some way to excuse all the companies that they didn't want to divest because they were their own clients. And so having a very low standard or a very wobbly line to separate the two sides that wobble, to suit their business purposes rather than socially responsible agenda purpose. And of course, that's still true to some extent. And it's, I think, definitely true that as it's become a very big business. I think I read in the Financial Times a year or two ago that it's something like a third of all the money that's actively managed in the world.
Well, that Bloomberg from 2021, that interview said 35 trillion ESG in managed assets.
Yeah, so that's up there. I think that's out of a total that was in the 80s or 90s. So it's still a little less than half. But I think it now is half. Oh no, I'm saying maybe it was and is 35 to 40%.
So how does ESG differ from SRI? I guess is the main thing. The pivot to ESG. How would you say it differs from SRI?
Well, I think the two names are self-explanatory. So socially responsible investing is interested in owning companies that are socially responsible and avoiding or taking proxy fights to companies that are bad actors. And it doesn't say there are only three kinds of bad acting: social, environment, social, and governance. It says, yes, we're interested in environmental responsibility. Yes, we're interested in responsibility to the local community. We're interested in responsibility to the global community. We're interested in responsibility to your customers, responsibility to your workers, responsibility to your neighbors. We're interested in, having a more diverse board of directors ethnically and in terms of gender. So ESG is not quite a shorthand for all that. I think it's not a shorthand because it wants to be a commercial product that you can advertise in the Wall Street Journal or on television. It doesn't want to be something that you explain to somebody and that you. I don't want to say that people don't actually do more than it says. There are certainly firms out there that are still trying to do everything I'm talking about. But I think there are also increasingly a lot of firms out there that don't do everything I'm talking about, and that sometimes don't even understand the question and say that they're doing it, but they don't even understand that they're not doing it. And they don't care because they want to say they're doing it because they think that's important. And I see this firsthand. I've talked to a lot of firms in the last few years because of my retirement and my looking for homes for, accounts that I've been managing. And I've seen a lot of pseudo-responsible investing in very little heartfelt, found, deeply rooted responsible, very, very little. Some people have, little, I don't know what to call them, little sort of, they're like scoreboards, These are the three things we look at under E. These are the four things we look at under G. These are the two things we look at under R. And if it's not there, it doesn't matter. It's the unspoken assumption or implication. But even if it is there, the way they sometimes implement it still doesn't matter.
Right. They just change the definition so that they can keep the companies that they don't want to piss off.
So a lot of people are willing to reward a company not because it passes on any of these screens, but because it's headed in the right direction. It's added its first woman to the board, and it's going to add more. It's closed its first, highly polluting facility, and it's planning to close the rest. Of course, it's a major oil company, but it's not doing any new bad things. Which in that particular case was Shell Oil, in the process of putting together an armada to sail north of the Arctic Circle to start drilling for oil in the Arctic Sea, as if that doesn't matter somehow. It's under the E signal. So it's very suspicious to me. The closer you look, the wackier and tardier it looks.
So I guess the last question would be, do you think, given capitalism's ability to absorb all critique and then repackage it, as a product to be sold that then goes back into reinforcing capitalism. And in terms of resisting or going against the complete annihilation of everything into profit. I mean, do you think investment as a vehicle for doing that is really that can really be is tenable anymore as an instrument anymore? Now that capitalism kind of caught up with it.
Yeah. I think it's always been weak, even at its highest point of strength.
Mm-hmm.
I think the examples of really big successes are those in which you had more or less readily available allies, fields. So for divestment from South Africa, you had a huge community of people who knew nothing at all about investing, who couldn't care less about investing, but who felt very strongly
mm-hmm.
about South Africa on the issue of nuclear power plants.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you have not quite as strong, but you do have a very strong independent movement, which has kind of succeeded because no one's built a new nuclear power plant now in a long time. And on very particular issues like an anti-union company that's having its third long strike, you have at least a broad, once upon a time you had a broad labor movement,
mm-hmm.
Which made a difference, and which made boycotts, consumer boycotts,
mm-hmm.
somewhat viable. And that doesn't seem to be true anymore. But without that other very strong ally, I don't think you're anywhere. I mean,
mm-hmm.
you don't have that much traction. So anybody that that violates traditional civil rights issues like people of color
mm-hmm.
is going to face possibility of a very widespread movement that can boycott its services and its goods as well as its stock, or even withhold their own services if it wants to underwrite it for bond writing or something like that. But most are not that simple or not that brief. I mean, they're long standing and it's going to take a long time. It has been taking a very long time, to make any progress at all on global pollution. I mean,
mm-hmm.
and global warming is the result. So there's a lesson there about the importance of having action at a higher level and holding politicians
mm-hmm.
who claim to be progressive to a much higher standard. Just speaking about my own state,
mm-hmm.
which has two more or less progressive, at least one definitely more, actually two. We have two very progressive senators, and we have an entirely Democratic roster of representatives who all claim to be very progressive, but who more often than not, don't even question the Defense Department appropriation bill.
Right.
Just let it go by. And who don't. I mean, they're pretty good about climate change, but they're pretty bad about it. They're pretty kind of center of the party consensus about most everything else.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I mean, at this stage, having seen starting in the 60s till now, kind of where things have gone during your journey, through activism and until now. I mean, to quote Lenin, "What is to be done?" I mean, what way to go? It's what are the instruments? Like, what do you think is an effective place for somebody to put their energy at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the people who are working on voter education,
mm-hmm.
and like everything else, I can't remember the alphabet soup names of them anymore, but I think that they're doing really important good work, and it's door to door, face to face, person to person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the only way to win, and
mm-hmm.
and it's to a very large extent the only way we have won, but we've won in the past as well.
Right.
So I think that's worthwhile. I think the Working Families Party and other independent organizations who are trying to elect people who break out of the Democratic Party, speed limits or range limits, and propose more encompassing and potentially successful approaches to these problems. I think that they're often worth supporting. There are certainly now at least maybe a dozen very progressive members of the House of Representatives, and maybe 4 or 5, even 6 very progressive senators who are close to a point of view, I think, that could really solve our problems if it were accepted. I think almost all of them won, outside the party establishment. With not all of them, but almost all of them were outside challengers with independent support and a lot of door-to-door knocking and phoning and canvassing. So I think electoral politics and demonstrations. I think demonstrations are important and were successful in both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. So not clear to me why. I mean, some things undermine them, like the internet and all that stuff, and everybody staying at home and just looking at the TV set, or communicating as we are now via visual and voice, and staying at home. That's definitely a contributor to maintenance of the status quo.
Right. You can't just talk. You have to actually be in the world with people to do something.
Right. And I think people are still doing demonstrations and rallies and marches, and I think that's good. I think it'd be better if more people were doing it. And I think it's possible, but it seems that one of the problems is the sense, based on experience, that the American government is beyond reform, and reform in the direction of a more sustainable world, free from the deadly threats of global warming and nuclear weapons, and so where we've really made the least progress, even though it's where we need to make the most progress. So, if the fate of the world, rests on our shoulders, whether we like it or not, it seems to me that should be some inspiration, some springboard, to get us out of the house and away from the TV set, and on the street with others, trying to do something, at least make some impression on more people who think they also should be trying to do something, which may eventually, hopefully, get something done. I mean, we do see local cities and even some states doing a lot more than the federal government or than even other countries are doing, but not that many and not that much. But there is some hope at the state and local level, I think.
Okay.
I went all the way around the circle.
Yeah, well, that's good. I think this is probably a good place to end it. But thank you so much for bearing with all the technical difficulties.
Well, I think I created more than half of them. I'm glad we could do it. Thank you. I enjoyed doing it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Robert.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks for listening. You can find plugs and links in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this, you can feel free to contribute to the Patreon at patreon.com/theliminauts. Till next time.